When people think about ancient weapons, their minds almost always go to the sword, polished steel, sharp edges, symbols of power and skill. It feels obvious, it feels right, and it's almost completely wrong. Because for most of human history, swords barely existed. Long before metal blades, long before armor, long before organized warfare, there was one tool that quietly decided whether humans lived or died. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't complex, and it wasn't designed to look impressive. It was the spear, a long piece of wood, a hardened point. That's it. And yet this simple design shaped human survival for tens of thousands of years. Not because it was powerful, but because it solved the most dangerous problem early humans faced: distance. Early humans weren't apex predators. They weren't the strongest, the fastest, or the most heavily armed creatures in their environment. Getting close to an animal wasn't heroic, it was reckless. One mistake meant injury. One injury meant death. Survival depended on avoiding contact, not seeking it. The spear changed everything. For the first time, humans could control space. They didn't need to overpower an animal. They didn't need to outfight it. They just needed to stay far enough away to remain alive. The spear wasn't about killing. It was about not being killed. That distinction matters more than we realize. This is why the spear appeared everywhere, in every climate, on every continent, among cultures that never met and never shared knowledge. Not because they copied each other, but because the logic was unavoidable. A tool that extends reach extends survival. And what's unsettling is how long that logic remained true. The spear outlasted countless inventions. It survived changes in climate, migration, and culture. It remained useful even as other weapons came and went. Not because it was advanced, but because it was adaptable. Easy to make, easy to repair, easy to understand. A tool that worked even when everything else failed. Modern people often underestimate it because it looks simple. But simplicity was its greatest advantage. No moving parts, no fragile components, no dependence on rare materials. If a spear broke, another could be made. If it dulled, it could be reshaped. The system didn't collapse when conditions changed. That's why the spear didn't disappear when better tools arrived. It disappeared when the world stopped requiring it. And that's what makes it so easy to misunderstand today. We judge ancient tools by modern standards of sophistication, not by the problems they were designed to solve. The spear wasn't a stepping stone towards something better. So, if this tool was so effective, so widespread, and so enduring, the real question isn't why ancient people used spears. The real question is why such a simple design worked so perfectly for so long. Once you understand why distance mattered, everything else about the spear starts to make sense. Not just why it existed, but why it came before almost every other weapon humans ever used. The spear wasn't a technological leap. It was a survival response, a direct answer to a world where getting too close was often fatal. Early humans didn't wake up one day and decide to invent weapons. They responded to pressure, to hunger, to danger, to environments where animals were larger, faster, and better equipped for combat. Teeth, claws, muscle, speed humans had none of those advantages. What they had was awareness, cooperation, and the ability to shape simple tools. The spear amplified all three. With a spear, humans didn't need to win a fight. They needed to manage space. A sharp point at the end of a long shaft turned distance into protection. It created a boundary, a zone where humans could observe, react, and act without immediately risking their lives. That boundary changed how hunting worked, how defense worked, and how groups functioned. This is why the spear didn't require strength to be effective. It required coordination, timing, positioning. A group of people with spears could do what individuals never could alone. They could guide movement, funnel animals, control direction. The spear wasn't a weapon of force. It was a tool of geometry. And geometry doesn't care how strong you are. The length of the spear mattered because it created leverage. The flexibility of the wood mattered because it absorbed energy instead of transmitting it directly back to the user. The weight mattered because it balanced speed with control. None of these choices were accidental. Over time, people learned what worked not through theory, but through consequence. If a spear was too short, it failed. If it was too heavy, it failed. If it was too rigid, it failed. And those failures didn't get repeated. This natural filtering shaped a tool that was deceptively refined. Not polished, not decorated, but tuned. Tuned to human limits, tuned to real environments. Tuned to survival rather than spectacle. What's often overlooked is how little material was required. A spear didn't depend on rare resources. It didn't require metal. It didn't require complex manufacturing. A straight branch, hardened in fire, could become a functional tool. That meant anyone could make one. Anyone could replace one. Anyone could learn to use one. This mattered enormously. In unstable environments, dependence is a weakness. Tools that require specialized materials or expertise fail when supply chains break. The spear didn't have that problem. It scaled naturally. It adapted to forests, plains, tundra, and coastlines. Its design changed slightly, but its logic never did. Distance equals time. Time equals choice. Choice equals survival. That equation made the spear inevitable. And because it was inevitable, it appeared independently across cultures. Not as imitation, but as convergence. Different peoples arrived at the same solution because the problem was the same everywhere. How do you approach danger without becoming vulnerable to it? The spear answered that question better than any other early tool. It allowed humans to stay just far enough away to remain safe, while still being close enough to act. It turned fear into something manageable. It transformed chaotic encounters into structured ones. And it did so without requiring dominance or brute force. This is why the spear remained relevant for so long. Not because humans failed to invent better weapons, but because better weapons weren't necessary for the problems they faced. The spear solved the right problem at the right time. And as long as that problem existed, the spear made sense. Only when environments changed, when animals changed, when societies changed, when warfare replaced hunting as the primary concern, did the spear begin to fade from everyday life. Not because it stopped working, but because its context disappeared. And that's the lesson hidden inside this simple tool. The spear wasn't primitive. It was precise. Precise in purpose, precise in design, precise in understanding what actually keeps humans alive. And once you see it that way, the spear stops being an ancient weapon. It becomes a reminder that intelligence isn't always about complexity. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly how much distance you need and never giving it up. Once distance became the priority, the design of the spear followed naturally. Not through theory, not through blueprints, but through repeated use in real conditions, where mistakes weren't abstract, they were immediate. The first thing that mattered was length. Too short, and the spear failed its purpose. It forced the hunter too close, where speed and strength decided the outcome. Too long, and control was lost. The spear became slow, unwieldy, difficult to reposition. Over time, an understanding emerged. The spear had to be long enough to create safety, but short enough to remain responsive. This balance wasn't measured in numbers, it was felt in the body. Then there was flexibility. Modern thinking often assumes that stiffness equals strength, But early humans learned something different. A spear that was too rigid transmitted force directly back into the hands. Impact became shock. Shock became loss of control. A slightly flexible shaft absorbed energy instead of reflecting it. It bent, recovered, and remained usable. That flexibility wasn't weakness. It was protection. This is why many ancient spears were made from specific types of wood, not because they were rare, but because they behaved predictably under stress. They bent instead of snapping. They returned to shape instead of failing suddenly. In a world where replacement wasn't guaranteed, this mattered more than durability on paper. Weight played a role too. A spear that was too light lacked authority. It didn't carry momentum. It failed to penetrate. Too heavy, and it slowed the user down. Fatigue set in quickly. The ideal spear wasn't heavy, it was balanced. Weight distributed along the shaft created control without sacrificing speed. Again, this wasn't calculated, it was discovered. And then there was the tip. Contrary to modern assumptions, the spear's effectiveness didn't depend on extreme sharpness. A razor edge dulled quickly. It chipped. It demanded constant maintenance. Ancient spears favored durable points, sharp enough to penetrate, strong enough to survive repeated use. Sometimes stone, sometimes bone, sometimes simply hardened wood. What mattered wasn't perfection. It was reliability. A spear didn't need to cut cleanly. It needed to function consistently. This reveals something important about ancient design. These tools weren't optimized for peak performance in ideal moments. They were optimized for average performance across many moments, across fatigue, across weather, across uncertainty. Modern tools often aim for maximum efficiency under controlled conditions. Ancient tools aimed for survivability under uncontrolled ones. Even the way spears were held reflects this thinking. They weren't just thrust forward blindly. They were used to guide movement, to block, to redirect, to maintain space. The spear wasn't only an offensive tool, it was defensive. A barrier as much as a weapon. That dual role is easy to miss. The spear allowed humans to stay engaged without committing fully, to test reactions, to respond without rushing. It created options. And options are what keep people alive. This is why spears worked so well across different environments. In forests, where visibility was limited. On plains, where speed mattered. Near water, where footing was unstable. The design didn't need to change dramatically. The logic already accounted for variability. Every element of the spear served that logic. Length created distance. Flexibility absorbed shock. Balance maintained control. Durability ensured continuity. None of these choices made the spear impressive to look at, but together they made it dependable. And dependence is the last thing ancient people could afford. They didn't have backups. They didn't have spare equipment. They didn't have the luxury of tools that worked only when conditions were right. The spear had to work when conditions were wrong. That's why it did. The spear wasn't designed by trying to make it stronger than nature. It was designed by accepting how nature behaves. And once you see that, the spear stops being just an early weapon. It becomes a lesson in design. A reminder that the most enduring tools aren't the ones that overpower reality, but the ones that move with it. Understanding the design is one thing. Seeing it work is something else entirely. Because ancient tools don't prove themselves in theory. They prove themselves in contact with reality. So, instead of imagining how a spear might have worked, we put it into conditions that resemble the environment it was designed for. Uneven ground, unpredictable movement, no perfect stance, no controlled setup, just space, balance, and the limits of the human body. The first thing that becomes obvious is control. When the spear is held at the right balance point, it doesn't feel heavy. It feels stable. The weight distributes itself naturally along the shaft, allowing small adjustments without strain. Even subtle movements of the hands translate into meaningful changes at the tip. This isn't brute force, it's leverage. As the spear moves forward, the flexibility of the shaft becomes visible. It doesn't remain perfectly rigid. It bends slightly, absorbing energy that would otherwise snap the wood or shock the user's grip. When contact is made against a target, a surface, or resistance, the spear yields just enough to remain intact. There's no violent recoil, no loss of control, just a smooth transfer of force. This is where many modern assumptions fall apart. People often expect ancient tools to feel crude or inefficient. Instead, the spear feels intuitive. It works with the body rather than against it. The length naturally creates distance without demanding constant effort. The user doesn't have to lunge forward aggressively. The spear allows engagement while staying grounded. And that grounded feeling matters. In real conditions, footing is rarely perfect. Rocks shift, soil gives way, balance changes constantly. A weapon that demands precision positioning fails quickly. The spear doesn't. Its design accounts for instability. It allows corrections mid-movement. Small missteps don't result in immediate failure. When the spear is repositioned, repeatedly lifted, angled, redirected, fatigue sets in slower than expected. That's not an accident. Ancient tools were designed for endurance, not bursts of performance. A hunter didn't need maximum force once. They needed sustainable control over time. Testing also reveals something subtle but important. The spear doesn't encourage reckless movement. It naturally promotes caution. Distance slows encounters. It creates time to observe, react, and choose. That pause is critical. In survival situations, hesitation isn't weakness. It's information gathering. This is why the spear worked so well in groups. Multiple spears don't create chaos, they create structure, overlapping zones of control, predictable boundaries. Animals and threats respond to that structure. Movement becomes guided rather than random. The spear doesn't dominate through violence, it manages through presence, and none of this requires exceptional strength. That's the part that surprises people most. The spear doesn't favor the strongest individual. It favors awareness, coordination, and restraint. It rewards positioning over aggression, timing over speed, balance over force. Modern tools often assume ideal users. Ancient tools assumed real ones. That difference shows immediately in testing. There's no sense that the spear demands mastery to function. It doesn't require perfect technique. It tolerates mistakes. It forgives imperfect angles. It adapts when the user adapts. That forgiveness is what allowed it to remain effective across generations, cultures, and environments. The spear wasn't tested once and declared successful. It was tested every day, against fatigue, against fear, against changing conditions. And each time it succeeded, it reinforced the same lesson. Tools don't survive because they are impressive. They survive because they are dependable. When you watch a spear move through space-controlled, deliberate, unhurried, you begin to understand why it lasted so long. Not because it was the best possible weapon in every scenario, but because it was good enough in almost all of them. And in a world without safety nets, that was more than enough. Once you step back from the testing, a bigger pattern starts to emerge. The spear didn't last for thousands of years because humans failed to invent something better. It lasted because, for a very long time, there was nothing that solved the same problem more reliably. The spear answered a question that never stopped being relevant. How do you stay alive when danger is unpredictable? As long as humans depended on hunting, foraging, and direct contact with the natural world, distance remained the most valuable advantage they had. The spear preserved that advantage without demanding specialization. It didn't require rare materials, complex training, or centralized production. It worked whether you were alone or in a group, whether the environment was familiar or new, whether conditions were calm or chaotic. That universality is why the spear appeared everywhere. Different cultures shaped it differently. Some made it longer, some made it lighter, some added stone tips, others relied on hardened wood. But the underlying logic never changed. Extend reach, control space, reduce risk. The details varied, but the principle endured. This is something modern perspectives often misunderstand. We tend to assume that tools disappear because they become obsolete, that progress naturally replaces old designs with superior ones. But history doesn't work that cleanly. Tools disappear when the problems they were designed to solve disappear, and the spear's problem unpredictable, close-range danger persisted for a very long time. As societies changed, the role of the spear shifted. Hunting methods evolved. Animals were domesticated. Warfare became more organized. Armor appeared. Metals became more accessible. New weapons emerged, optimized for different contexts. Not necessarily better, but better suited to new realities. The spear didn't vanish overnight. It adapted. It became a throwing weapon, a formation weapon, a ceremonial object. Even when swords rose in prominence, spears remained common. They were easier to make, easier to maintain, easier to replace, and in many cases more effective when used collectively. This tells us something important. The spear wasn't replaced because it failed. It was replaced because human environments became more controlled. Settlements grew. Supply chains stabilized. Specialized roles emerged. Tools no longer needed to work everywhere, for everyone, all the time. But in unstable conditions, the spear never stopped making sense. That's why variations of it still exist today. In hunting tools, in fishing spears, in survival equipment, in training disciplines. The design persists because the logic persists. When distance matters, simplicity wins. And simplicity doesn't mean primitive, it means focused. The spear solved exactly the problem it was meant to solve and nothing more. It didn't try to be versatile in ways that compromised its purpose. It didn't chase elegance. It didn't depend on ideal conditions. It remained honest about what humans could and couldn't control. That honesty is rare. Modern tools often promise more than they can deliver. They perform beautifully under perfect conditions and poorly outside them. Ancient tools made no such promises. They worked quietly, consistently, and without spectacle. The spear lasted because it respected human limits. It respected fatigue. It respected fear. It respected uncertainty. And tools that respect those things tend to endure. When you look at the spear through this lens, it stops being an early step toward more advanced weapons. It becomes a complete solution to a specific set of realities. A reminder that endurance isn't about constant improvement. It's about relevance. The spear remained relevant because the world remained dangerous. And even today, when we live surrounded by layers of technology and protection, that lesson still resonates. Not because we need to return to spears, but because we still design tools, systems, and structures that fail when conditions drift from ideal. The spear didn't fail under imperfect conditions. It was built for them, and that is why it lasted for thousands of years. When you strip the spear down to its essence, what remains isn't a weapon, it's a decision to value distance over domination, control over chaos, awareness over brute force. Ancient people didn't design the spear to look impressive. They designed it to work when fear was real and mistakes were costly. They didn't assume ideal conditions. They assumed the opposite: uneven ground, unclear outcomes, bodies that tired, hands that shook. And in that reality, the spear offered something rare: time. Time to react, time to adjust, time to survive. That's why this design feels so different from many modern tools. It doesn't promise perfection. It doesn't remove risk entirely. It manages it. It acknowledges danger without trying to eliminate it. And that approach feels almost foreign in a world obsessed with control. We tend to think progress means removing uncertainty, building systems so precise that nothing unexpected can happen. But ancient tools like the spear remind us that uncertainty never disappears. It just shifts. And when systems are built as if uncertainty doesn't exist, they fail the moment it returns. The spear didn't fail when conditions changed. It adapted. It worked for individuals and for groups, for hunting and for defense, for beginners and for the experienced. It didn't require mastery to function, only understanding. And that understanding was passed down not through manuals, but through use. That's why the spear doesn't feel outdated. It feels honest. Honest about human limits. Honest about danger. Honest about what actually keeps people alive. And that honesty is what allowed it to endure for so long. We often judge ancient tools by what they lack. No metal, no complexity, no refinement. But what they lack is often what made them resilient. They didn't depend on fragile systems. They didn't assume stability. They didn't break when the world became unpredictable. They were built for a world that already was. The spear teaches a quiet lesson that goes far beyond hunting or history. It reminds us that the most durable solutions aren't always the most advanced ones. They're the ones that solve the right problem, in the simplest way, for the longest possible time. And maybe that's why this design still captures our attention today. Not because we want to use spears again, but because somewhere beneath the layers of modern life, we recognize the logic. Distance creates safety, simplicity creates reliability, and tools that respect reality tend to last. Sometimes progress doesn't mean inventing something new. Sometimes it means understanding why something old worked so well, and remembering what it was really designed to protect.